The first thing Daniel said was, "My parents will be at your cabin by Friday." He did not ask. He did not even pause. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, one hand still on a half-open box, and looked out at the pines behind my new place near Bozeman. I had been there less than a day. I had spent 42 years building roads, bridges, retaining walls, and other things people used without ever thinking about who made them safe. At 68, I had finally done one selfish thing for myself. I had bought a small cabin with the savings of a lifetime so I could live quietly, breathe cold mountain air, and stay out of other people's noise. Then my son-in-law called and informed me that my peace was over. I said, "Daniel, I think you have me confused with someone who agreed to that." He laughed once, not because anything was funny. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when he thinks the matter is already settled. "They just need a place for a while," he said. "You're alone out there anyway. If you can't handle people, then go back to the city." That was the first time I felt it. Not anger, not yet. Something heavier. The feeling that a line had already been crossed before I was even told it existed. Tell me honestly, would that have sounded normal to you? I had retired 6 months earlier. Until then, my life had run on schedules, inspection reports, weather delays, and hard decisions that kept projects from failing. I was a construction engineer. I spent most of my adult life solving problems before they became disasters. That habit did not leave me when I left the job. So when Daniel spoke to me that way, I did not raise my voice. I started paying attention. The cabin sat on a small piece of land outside Bozeman, far enough from town to feel honest. That was what I wanted. A porch, a wood stove, pine trees, snow in winter, quiet mornings. I did not buy it to host anyone or become a solution for problems other people created. I bought it because after decades of work, deadlines, and family pressure, I wanted a place where no one could tell me what I owed them. Earlier that same afternoon, before Daniel called, I had spoken to my daughter Emily. Emily was 39, a grade school teacher, and for most of her life she had tried to keep peace where peace did not really exist. She congratulated me on the cabin. She sounded tired, but warm. "I'm glad you finally did it," she said. "You've talked about this place for years." "I should have done it sooner," I told her. She laughed softly. "You probably should have." Then her voice changed, just a little. I asked, "Everything all right?" "Daniel's under a lot of pressure," she said. "Work's been rough. Money too. It's just been a lot lately." She did not say more than that. She did not need to. A father learns the difference between what a daughter says and what she is trying not to say. I asked, "Is he treating you right?" There was a pause long enough to notice. "He's stressed," she repeated. That answer stayed with me. By evening, after Daniel's call, it stayed with me even more. I spent that first night in the cabin listening to the wind move through the trees and thinking about ownership. I had signed every paper, paid every dollar. The place was mine, plain and simple. Yet Daniel spoke as if my property had become an extension of his household. Not a request, not a favor, an assumption. And assumptions like that do not come from nowhere. I wanted to know every slope, fence post, path, and place a vehicle could pull in unseen from the porch. I checked the tree line, the back of the property, and the rough open ground beyond the cabin. In Montana, nature is still in charge. That mattered to me. Then I made a few practical decisions. I installed cameras around the cabin. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to show who came and went, who stood on the porch, and who lingered where they should not. I also set out bait meat on a nearby section of land, away from the cabin but close enough to draw the kind of wildlife that already lived in that area. I did not create the wilderness. I simply respected it better than my in-laws ever would. A few days later, I got another call from Daniel. "They'll be there this afternoon," he said. Again, not a question. I said I never agreed to that. "They don't have options," he snapped. "You have space. I have a cabin," I said. "That's different." He let out a hard breath. This is what family does. By mid-afternoon, Robert and Helen Brooks arrived in an SUV packed like they meant to stay. Robert was 71. Helen was 69. I had known them for years, though never well enough to trust them. They stepped out slowly, looking over the cabin and property the way people do when assessing what they think they can use. Helen smiled at me as if we were all participating in a pleasant misunderstanding. "Well," she said, "it's rustic." Robert looked at the porch. "We can make it work for a little while." I said, "You seem to think this is settled." Helen waved a hand. "Daniel explained everything. I'm sure he did, I said. He just forgot one part. This cabin belongs to me. Robert gave me the look some men reserve for people they assume can still be pushed. We're family. I said, that doesn't change the deed. You tell me. Was I supposed to ignore that? They brought bags to the porch anyway. Helen asked where they should put their things. I said, back in the car would be my suggestion. Robert's face tightened. You'd really put us out? I looked past them toward the far edge of the property, where the tree line thickened and the air seemed to shift. The meat I had placed out earlier had not gone untouched. I knew that because I had already checked the cameras that morning. Before I could answer Robert, Helen turned toward the open ground and froze. What is that? First one movement, then several. A small pack of wolves had come near the bait area, not racing, not attacking, just moving with the quiet confidence of animals that belonged there more than any of us did. They were not at the porch. They were not cornering anyone. But to people who thought a mountain cabin was just cheap housing with scenery, it was enough. Helen grabbed Robert's arm so hard he stumbled. Robert said, "Get in the car." I stayed where I was. They moved faster than I would have expected at their age. Bags were dropped. One suitcase tipped on the dirt. Helen was breathing hard before she even reached the passenger side. Robert slammed the rear hatch halfway shut, reopened it, then shoved loose items in without organizing anything. Helen shouted, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "You're in wild country." That was when I knew two things. First, they had not thought this through. Second, none of this was about wanting a simple temporary shelter. If it had been, they would have asked first, talked terms, and acted with at least a little humility. They did none of that. Robert pointed at me from the driver's side. "You set this up." "I bought a cabin in Montana," I said. "The wolves handled the rest." Helen got in. Robert followed. The SUV backed out too fast, tires throwing gravel, and in less than a minute they were gone. I watched the dust settle and knew the matter would not end there. Daniel called before evening. "You think this is funny?" he shouted. "I think your parents made a bad assumption. You staged that." "I live in the wilderness," I said. "That's not staging, that's geography." He was quiet for 1 second. Then he said something colder. "Emily doesn't need this from you." That sentence told me more than his yelling had. He was already turning toward pressure, not persuasion. Pressure. He wanted this cabin because he needed something. I did not yet know what, but I knew I had just become an obstacle. That night, I checked my cameras, locked every door, and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I wrote down dates, times, calls, and exact phrases I remembered. I had done that kind of thing my whole career. When something feels wrong, you document before people start changing their story. I still wonder what you would have done in my place, and Daniel's story, I was certain, was only beginning. The next week, Daniel stopped trying to force the cabin through direct demands. He used Emily instead. She called me on a Tuesday evening. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they are trying to make something unreasonable sound harmless. "Dad," she said, "maybe this got off on the wrong foot." "Maybe," I said. "They just need somewhere stable for a while." I let that sit for a second. "Then why did no one ask me?" She did not answer that. Instead, she said, "Daniel thinks you overreacted." That was rich, coming from a man who had tried to assign my home like it was a spare room. Still, I kept my tone even. "I didn't overreact," I said. "I said no." Emily exhaled. "Could you at least meet them? Just talk?" That request was reasonable in a way the earlier demands were not. So I agreed to meet Robert and Helen in a cafe in Bozeman. Not because I planned to change my mind. Because I wanted to hear how they explained themselves when they could no longer pretend I had already surrendered. I arrived early. The place was quiet, with the low hum of cups, chairs, and people minding their own business. Robert and Helen came in together. They did not look grateful. They looked inconvenienced. That told me enough before anyone sat down. Helen said, "We appreciate you taking the time." I said, "That depends on how this goes." Robert frowned at that, but I kept going. I put a printed rental agreement on the table between us. Cabin address. Monthly rate based on local market. Deposit. Utility responsibilities. Duration. Terms of occupancy. Clear. Simple. Legal. Helen stared at it as if I had insulted her. "What is this?" she asked. "It's a lease," I said. "If you want to stay at my cabin, those are the terms." Robert leaned back in his chair. "You're charging family market rate? I'm protecting my property." Helen's mouth tightened. Families don't do this. I looked at her. Families also don't move into someone's home without permission. Robert tapped the paper once with 2 fingers. This is selfish. No, I said. This is ownership. That was when the masks slipped. They stopped speaking about temporary need and started speaking about what I owed. About Emily. About family duty. About age. About how a man living alone did not need that much space. About how some people become isolated and difficult. Every sentence was designed to make the boundary itself seem like the offense. Maybe you see it differently. But to me, that was the moment the real argument came into view. This was never about a roof for a few nights. This was about control. I pushed the lease a little closer to Robert. If you want a place, sign it. He pushed it back. We won't be treated like strangers. I said, then don't treat me like a fool. The meeting ended there. No raised voices, no dramatic scene. They simply stood, offended by limits, and left. By the end of that week, stories about me had begun moving through the family. I heard it first from a cousin who called and tried to sound casual. How are you doing out there? He asked. Fine, I said. Why? He hesitated. Daniel said you've been pretty isolated. Said you might not be thinking clearly. There it was. A boundary they could not break by guilt would now be attacked through reputation. I said, Daniel says a lot of things. My cousin laughed awkwardly, then changed the subject. But the message had already arrived. I was being framed, softly at first, as an old man alone in the woods, whose judgment could no longer be trusted. That story was not random either. It was preparation. A few days later, Emily called again. She sounded upset, not angry, worn down. Dad, people are talking, she said. I know. Daniel says you're shutting everyone out. I'm shutting one thing out, I said. People trying to take what isn't theirs. She was quiet. Then, without meaning to, she gave me the first real piece of the puzzle. His parents are desperate, she said. Robert lost $47,000 online. Gambling. They lost the house. Daniel says they're humiliated. I sat back in my chair. There are moments when facts arrange themselves in front of you so fast you can almost hear the click. Robert had lost $47,000 gambling online. They had lost their home. Daniel had tried to move them into my cabin without asking. Now Daniel was telling relatives that I was not mentally sound. That was when suspicion turned into structure. I asked, Emily, how long have you known that? Not long, she said. Daniel only told me after all this started. Did he tell you everything? She answered too quickly. I think so. That think mattered. I did not push harder then. She was still trying to hold 2 realities together, loyalty to her husband and the growing sense that he was not telling the truth. I knew if I forced too much too soon, she would retreat. So I stayed calm. I said, I'm sorry you're in the middle of this. I don't want sides, she said. Sometimes sides already exist, I told her. We just noticed late. After that call, I made another decision. Up to that point, I had been acting like a man protecting his privacy, cameras, notes, boundaries. But privacy was no longer the issue. The issue was a coordinated effort to pressure me, discredit me, and possibly use my property as a financial lifeline. That required more than common sense. So I called Samuel Reed, an attorney in Bozeman. I chose him for one simple reason. He had a reputation for being thorough and boring, which is exactly what you want when your life is being turned into someone else's story. We met in his office 2 days later. I gave him dates, call records, copies of the lease offer, and a summary of every major conversation. He read quietly for several minutes. Then he looked up and asked, Do you think they're trying to establish residency? I think they're trying everything. He nodded. Good answer. Samuel did not waste words. He told me to keep documenting, save messages, record interactions on my property where legal. Do not make threats. Do not improvise. Let facts do the work. I understood that language. He also said something else that stayed with me. People usually escalate when they realize they can't charm their way in. That turned out to be true, because once the guilt failed and the lease failed and the family whispers began, Daniel changed tactics again. He came to the cabin in person. I saw his truck on the camera first, then through the front window. He got out hard, slamming the door like he wanted the sound to arrive before he did. I stepped onto the porch but did not go down to meet him. He looked up at me and said, What are you doing to my family? I said, Protecting my property. You're humiliating Emily. No, I said, You're doing that. His jaw tightened. You think you're smarter than everyone. I think deeds matter. He took a few steps forward. You don't get to blow up my wife's family because you want to play Mountain King. There it was again. Not my daughter. My wife's family. He spoke as if Emily were part of a package deal he managed. I said leave. Instead of leaving, he pointed toward the cabin. That place should be helping family, not sitting empty. Should. The word told the whole story. He had already assigned moral ownership to himself. Would you have trusted him after that? I kept my phone recording in my shirt pocket and said, you need to go now. He lowered his voice then, which made it worse. If you keep this up, he said, Emily may be done with you. I looked at him for a long moment. There are threats men make in anger, and there are threats they use because they know where to aim. That one was chosen carefully. I said, if that's what you came here to say, you're finished. He stared at me, then turned, got back in his truck, and left gravel spinning behind him. I stood on the porch until the sound faded. Then I went inside, saved the recording, added notes to my file, and understood that this had crossed into something else entirely. Daniel was not asking for help. He was trying to force surrender through my daughter, and that meant whatever he was hiding was worse than gambling losses and a lost house. I just did not know how much worse yet. Samuel told me that if Daniel and his parents were trying to paint me as confused or unstable, I needed more than my own notes. I needed proof that would hold up when sympathy and gossip did what they always do. So I took a cognitive health assessment. I did it before anyone formally accused me of anything. That was the point. I was not going to sit still and let people build a story around my age. I wanted a clean medical record showing that I was competent, aware, and fully capable of managing my own affairs. When the results came back, they were exactly what I expected. No impairment, no diminished capacity, no concern. I put the report in Samuel's file. Then we started looking harder at the financial side. The more I thought about Emily's slip about the $47,000 Robert had lost, the less any of this looked temporary. Gambling losses do not vanish because a son-in-law finds a cabin. People who make a move this aggressive are usually trying to stop something from collapsing. Samuel agreed. He asked, how much access does Daniel have to Emily's finances? I don't know, I said. Too much, most likely. Find out carefully, he said. I did not go digging through my daughter's life on my own. I waited. Age teaches that people reveal more when they still think they can manage the truth. Emily called me 3 nights later. She sounded exhausted. I don't know why this keeps getting worse, she said. Because someone keeps pushing it, I answered. She said Daniel was furious that I had gone to a lawyer. I had not told her that directly, which meant he had found out another way. He was watching me, maybe not with cameras, but through calls, assumptions, and the normal channels people use when they think family means access without limits. Then she said something that changed the whole shape of the situation. Daniel said if you'd just stop fighting him, none of this would be happening. I sat very still after that. Not if you would help, not if we could all sit down. If you'd just stop fighting him. That is not the language of a misunderstanding. That is the language of a campaign. I asked her, Emily, what exactly is he trying to prevent? She hesitated. Then she said, I found a notice in the mail. About money. He said it was old. What kind of notice? I don't know. A loan. Something about the house. I could hear her breathing change as she said it. She was already afraid of the answer. Did you ask him directly? I said. He told me not to worry. That was enough. Samuel moved quickly once I told him. With Emily's situation in mind and the facts we already had, he pushed to review what could legally be reviewed. What came back was worse than I expected, though by then not surprising. Daniel had secretly borrowed $35,000 against the line of credit on the house he and Emily lived in. She had not known. And the man telling relatives I was not in my right mind had quietly tied my daughter's home to his own financial trouble. That was when everything finally locked into place. Robert lost $47,000 online and lost the house. Daniel borrowed $35,000 against Emily's home without her knowledge. They wanted my cabin, not because they admired the scenery, because they needed an asset they could use, occupy, or leverage while the rest of their mess closed in around them. That still wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Emily was standing in the middle of it without the facts. Samuel said, now you know motive. I knew motive before, I said. Now I know the numbers. He nodded. Numbers help. He was right. Numbers cut through emotion. A week later, the next move came. Not from Daniel directly this time. From Adult Protective Services. A complaint had been filed claiming I was isolated, mentally unfit, and vulnerable to making unsafe decisions about my living situation and finances. The filing was false, but it was detailed enough to be annoying, which meant it had not been done carelessly. Robert, Helen, and Daniel had taken family gossip and turned it into a formal attempt to strip authority from me. Samuel just looked at the notice and said, "Good thing you prepared." The investigator who visited was professional. I treated her the same way I had treated safety auditors for decades. Calm answers, complete records. I showed her the cabin. I showed her my financial paperwork. I showed her the cognitive assessment. I showed her ownership documents, camera logs, and a written timeline of the conflict. She asked, "Did you invite anyone to live here?" "No." "Have you been threatened?" "Yes." "By whom?" I gave names. She asked whether I was trying to isolate myself from family. I told her no. I was trying to stop certain people from taking over my property. Those are not the same thing. The interview lasted a while. When it ended, she did not say much. She did not need to. Professionals who know what they are looking at rarely do. A few days later, the matter was closed. No impairment, no exploitation, no basis for intervention. In other words, the truth. Maybe I was wrong, but it didn't feel like concern. It felt like a failed attempt to remove me from my own life. Daniel called that night. His voice was low and angry in a way I had started to recognize. "You really took it that far." I said, "You filed the complaint. You forced it." "No," I said. "You ran out of cleaner ways to lie." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Emily is falling apart because of this." I answered, "Emily is falling apart because you keep building things on top of her without telling her." He hung up. That should have been enough for any decent man. It was not enough for Daniel. Because when false concern failed, the pressure came back in person. He drove out again. This time later in the day, when the light was already thinning and the trees made long shadows across the yard. I did not meet him outside immediately. I let the cameras run. I made sure my phone was ready. Then I opened the door. He did not bother pretending to be civil. "You're destroying my marriage," he said. I said, "You're confusing exposure with destruction." He came one step closer. "Emily said you've been filling her head. I've been answering her questions." His face changed at that. For a second, I could see fear under the anger. Real fear. Not of me, of losing control. "If she walks away from this family," he said, "that's on you." "No," I said. "It's on whatever made you so desperate." He stared at me and said the quietest thing he had ever said. "You should have stayed out of it. There are sentences that confirm everything. That was one of them." I said, "It became my business when you aimed it at my property and my daughter." He looked toward the cabin, then back at me. "You think a stack of papers makes you untouchable?" "No," I said. "I think facts make you loud." He left after that. I recorded the whole exchange and sent it to Samuel. The next morning, Samuel called me with another development. He had found evidence that Robert and Helen were using my cabin's address for bank correspondence and benefit records, even though they had never lived there. That changed the matter again. This was no longer just family pressure and false accusations. Now it was fraud tied directly to my property. Samuel's voice stayed as flat as ever. "We need to report it." I said, "Then report it." He did. At that point, I stopped thinking in terms of conflict and started thinking in terms of sequence. One fact, then the next. One document, then the next. One lie, then the next. People like Daniel survive by making each problem seem separate. Stress, family, misunderstanding, hurt feelings, temporary need. But once you line the facts up in order, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And by then the pattern was clear. You tell me, was I supposed to trust any of that? They had tried guilt. They had tried pressure. They had tried family shame. They had tried calling me unstable. They had used my address. They had hidden debt from Emily. They had tried to make my cabin the answer to a crisis they created. And for the first time since moving to Montana, I began to think beyond defense. Not revenge. Defense with an ending. Because facts can expose a man. But sometimes you still have to decide what to do with him after the truth is fully visible. The investigation into Robert and Helen moved faster than the rest of the family expected. Fraud usually does once paperwork gets involved. They had used my cabin address for bank mail and benefit records, even though they did not live there. It was the kind of lie people tell themselves is minor, because it sits on paper instead of in a voice. But paper lasts longer. Once Samuel put the evidence in front of the right people, the matter stopped being a private family dispute. That was the first real shift in power. Up to then, Daniel had operated as if pressure could solve everything. Push harder, talk faster, make me look unreasonable, keep Emily off balance, keep his parents moving, keep every problem just blurry enough that no one focused on the whole picture. But fraud makes a picture clearer, and it made Daniel dangerous. Not violent, dangerous in the way cornered men often are. He started calling more. Then he stopped calling and started sending short messages that said almost nothing and meant plenty. We need to settle this. You're making things worse. Think about Emily. Every message tried to put me back in the role he preferred. The father who could be manipulated through guilt. That role was gone by then. Around the same time, I learned something else. Emily in Daniel's house was in deeper trouble than she understood. The $35,000 line of credit Daniel had taken without telling her was only part of the pressure closing in around them. Missed mortgage payments had put the house in danger. Samuel helped me confirm the status, and when I saw the numbers, I made a decision I did not discuss with anyone except him. I quietly bought the overdue mortgage debt, not to take Emily's home from her, to keep it from being taken by strangers while I figured out how to get her clear of the man tying anchors to her life. Samuel asked, "Are you sure?" I said, "If I don't control that debt, Daniel will find a way to use it." He considered that and nodded. "Then do it cleanly." So I did. No speeches, no warning, no leverage used too early. Just another fact placed where it needed to be. I had spent a career learning that timing matters as much as structure. Reveal something before the supports are ready, and the whole thing collapses the wrong way. Then Robert and Helen were arrested. I was not there when it happened. I heard through Samuel first, then through the kind of family whisper network that had once been used against me. Funny how fast concern turns into silence when handcuffs enter the story. Daniel called within an hour. His breathing was uneven. "Did you do this?" "I gave the truth to people who handle truth," I said. "They're old." "So am I." He said nothing to that. Then he tried a different angle. "Emily can't take this." I answered, "Emily has been taking more than you ever admitted." He hung up. That evening, I sat alone in the cabin and looked at the file cabinet by the wall. It held copies of everything now. Lease, recordings, medical report, debt records, complaint documents. It struck me then that the entire conflict had started because Daniel assumed age meant softness, isolation meant weakness, and fatherhood meant endless surrender. He had been wrong on all three. The next step had to be Emily. I asked her to come to the cabin. Not for an argument, not for a dramatic family summit, just her and me. She arrived looking like she had not slept properly in weeks. She stepped inside, looked around, and for a moment I saw the little girl who used to study my face before deciding how bad the truth might be. "What's happening?" she asked. I said, "Sit down." We sat at the kitchen table, same table where I had written the first notes after Daniel's original call. I put the file in front of her and opened it piece by piece. Not all at once. She could not have absorbed it that way. First, Robert's gambling losses, then the loss of the Brooks house, then the false complaint to Adult Protective Services, then proof that Robert and Helen had used my cabin address, then the $35,000 credit line Daniel had taken against her home without telling her. She stared at the documents for a long time. At one point she whispered, "No." I said nothing. A parent learns that silence is sometimes the only decent place to let pain land. She kept reading. Her hands began to shake when she reached the loan records. "He said it was paperwork," she said. "It was debt," I answered. "He said it was temporary. It was hidden." Tears came then, but quietly. Emily had never been theatrical. Hurt made her smaller, not louder. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked. "Because he knew the answer. So did I. But I let her get there herself." I said, "What do you think?" She covered her mouth and looked down. "Because I would have stopped him." That was the most honest thing she had said in months. I slid one more document toward her, the status of the mortgage debt. Then I told her what I had done. "I bought the overdue debt on the house," I said. She looked up sharply. "You did what?" I made sure strangers couldn't take it first. Her face went from confusion to alarm. "Dad," I held up a hand. "Listen to me." She did. "If you decide to leave Daniel," I said, "I will erase that debt. You will not lose your home because of what he did." She stared at me like she could not decide whether I had saved her or trapped her. I understood that. Control had been used on her for too long, so I said the one thing that mattered most. "I'm not forcing you. I'm giving you a way out." That changed something in the room. Not everything, but something. She looked back at the file, then at me. You really think it's that bad? I said, I think it's worse than what you knew. Would you have stayed quiet after that? Emily left the cabin with copies of the records. She did not promise anything. I did not ask. She needed to think without Daniel in the room shaping the air around her. 2 days later, Samuel called with another update. Daniel had tried to list the house for sale. He could not. The debt position prevented him from moving quickly, and for the first time, one of his usual escape routes was blocked. He called me almost immediately. You have no right, he said. I have every right. That's my house. It's Emily's too, I said. Which is more than you acted like when you borrowed against it. He was breathing hard enough that I could hear the anger scrape in his throat. What do you want? That was the question he should have asked from the start. I said, meet me. We met in Bozeman with Samuel present. Daniel came alone. He looked older than he had a month earlier. Fear does that fast. I put the final papers on the table. If you sign divorce papers, I said, and sign away any claim, access, or expectation related to my property, I will release the house debt. He stared at me. Samuel said nothing. Daniel asked, and if I don't? Do? I answered, then you keep carrying what you built. That was when his whole posture changed, not into dignity, into recognition. He finally understood that for once he was dealing with a structure he could not bluff, shame, or shout down. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he said, Emily knows about this? I said, Emily knows enough. He almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. You planned this. No, I told him. You did. He signed. Slowly, bitterly, but he signed. And with that, the part of the story he thought he controlled was over. The rest belonged to Emily. Was I overreacting? By then, I don't think any honest person could say I was. Emily filed for divorce not long after that meeting. She did not call me first. She called me after. That mattered. For the first time in a long time, she had made a decision before asking someone else how she was supposed to feel about it. When she told me, her voice was steady in a way I had not heard for months. It's done, she said. I stood on the porch of the cabin while she spoke. The morning was cold enough that my breath showed in the air. Are you all right? I asked. No, she said. Then after a pause, but I think I will be. That was honest. More honest than anything Daniel had said through this entire mess. The divorce papers moved forward. Daniel had already signed what he needed to sign to save himself from the debt closing in around the house. Once a man has been reduced to choosing between pride and consequences, he usually picks the option that leaves him breathing. He had done that. Not nobly, just predictably. I released the debt as promised. I did it because I had given my word to Emily, and because I never wanted her to wonder whether my help had been another form of control. That distinction mattered to me. Boundaries protect, control consumes. Too many people confuse the two. Emily moved out and, in time, moved closer to Bozeman. She bought a small house of her own and stayed with her work as a grade school teacher. Nothing about it was grand. That was part of why I respected it. After months of lies, hidden loans, pressure, and humiliation, she did not chase appearances. She chose something modest, clear, and manageable, a life she could actually stand inside without fear of what was hidden under it. But before any of that settled, there was still fallout. Relatives who had gone quiet during the fraud investigation began circling back in cautious ways. A few called to check in. A few acted as though they had never repeated Daniel's story about me losing my mind. A few wanted to talk about how unfortunate everything had become, as if misfortune had simply fallen from the sky and not been built through lies, debt, and entitlement. I did not argue with any of them. I did not need apologies for my peace to remain intact. That was when I realized something had changed in me too. At the start of all this, I had wanted only to be left alone in the cabin I had earned. By the end, I still wanted that, but I also understood something I had resisted for years. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is just the room where someone else arranges your life for you. Emily came back to the cabin about 3 weeks after the divorce was underway. This time, she was different when she walked in. Still tired, still hurt, but no longer confused about who had done what. She sat at the same kitchen table where I had shown her the documents, and for a while neither of us said much. Then she looked at me and said, "You were trying to protect me." I answered carefully, "I was trying to protect what I could." She nodded once. "I didn't want to see it." "I know. You knew before I did." Yes, there was no satisfaction in saying that. A father does not want to be proven right at that cost. She asked, "Why didn't you tell me harder?" The question stayed in the room for a moment. Then I said, "Because if I pushed before you were ready, you would have defended him." She looked down. I probably would have. That honesty was part of her recovery too. I made coffee. We sat with it. The wind moved outside. The place was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This was not the quiet of avoidance. It was the quiet that comes after noise has finally run out of places to hide. Midway through that visit, Emily asked about the wolves. It almost made me smile. "All this started there," she said. "Did you really expect them?" "I live in Montana," I said. She actually laughed then. Small, tired, but real. "So you did." "I respected the land," I answered. "Your in-laws didn't." That was enough. We did not need to turn it into something clever. The truth was plain enough already. The cabin had never been a harmless convenience. It had been a target, a fallback, a piece of property other people thought they could fold into their crisis because I was old, alone, and supposed to be grateful for family attention. They had mistaken restraint for weakness. That mistake cost them more than they expected. In the months that followed, my relationship with Emily rebuilt slowly. That was the only way it could have been honest. We were not going to step around what happened and pretend one good conversation repaired everything. Trust does not return because people say they love each other. It returns when actions stop contradicting words. She visited more often, sometimes for lunch, sometimes just to sit on the porch, sometimes to ask practical things about paperwork, money, or repairs on her new place. Those were my favorite conversations, not because they were dramatic, because they were normal, useful, clean. The kind of father-daughter moments that do not need speeches. One afternoon, she stood by the window and looked out over the trees. "I used to think you were pulling away from everyone," she said. "I was trying to get some air," I answered. She nodded. "I see that now." There were still hard subjects we touched only in pieces. Daniel. The years she spent trying to keep things smooth. The way guilt had been used on her. The fact that people who talk most about family often mean obedience, not care. We did not solve all that in a season, but we were finally speaking inside the truth, and that was enough to begin with. As for Daniel, I heard little after the divorce moved forward. That was fine with me. Men like him rarely disappear because they become noble. They disappear because the audience is gone. Once Emily saw the debt, the lies, the false complaint, and the attempt to turn my cabin into an answer for his failures, his leverage was finished. He had no moral language left to hide inside, and Robert and Helen were no longer anyone's harmless burden either. Their fraud case made sure of that. For all their talk about family and respect, they had been willing to use my address, my property, and my name as one more tool to keep themselves afloat. In the end, none of them were stopped by shouting. That part matters. I did not beat them by being louder. I beat them by refusing to surrender facts. I kept records. I set boundaries. I prepared before they accused. I answered paper with paper. I gave my daughter the truth before I gave her advice. And when the time came, I made one clear offer and let Daniel decide what his own choices had already cost him. That is how the cabin stayed mine. That is how Emily got out. That is how peace returned, slowly, without celebration. I still live near Bozeman in the cabin I bought with the savings of my working life. The mornings are quiet here. The porch faces the trees. In winter, the snow settles clean. In summer, the air carries pine and dust and the sound of distance. No one tells me now what my home is for. No one informs me who will be staying. No one mistakes my silence for consent. Sometimes Emily visits after school. Sometimes she brings papers she wants me to look over. Sometimes we say very little. That is all right. Not every repaired thing needs to be talked to death. Some losses are loud. Some justice is quiet. Mine was quiet. And that was enough.